The man trips on the temple floor. His arms flop. His mouth hangs open. The royal princes howl with laughter as their cousin, the family imbecile, falls flat on his face inside the sanctuary at Delphi. His name is Lucius Junius Brutus, Rome's court fool, the drooling joke the king keeps around for amusement. The oracle has just delivered her verdict. Whichever of them is the first to kiss his mother will rule Rome. The princes are already turning, already planning the race home to the queen. But Brutus stays down, lips pressed to the dirt, holding the kiss. He is not kissing the ground. He is kissing the earth, the mother of every living thing, the mother the oracle never named. This is not the gesture of a half-wit. This is the silent oath of a man who has spent years sharpening a knife inside his own skull. You think you know this story. A wicked king, a violated noblewoman, a republic born from outrage, clean, simple. A morality play with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Forget it. What happened in Rome in 509 BC was not a spontaneous revolution. It was a slow, patient hunt. Brutus had watched his uncle, King Tarquinius Superbus, murder his way to the throne. He had watched the same king butcher members of his own family, including Brutus's brother. So Brutus chose the only disguise that kept him breathing. He played the idiot. He let them mock him. He let them spit in his food. He waited. The royal house was already rotting from within, a nest of vipers wrapped around a stolen crown. Brutus did not need to create the monster. He only needed the moment the monster overreached. That moment would come through a woman. Her name was Lucretia. Her body was about to be turned into a political document. Her pain was about to be lifted out of her hands and pressed into the foundation stones of a new Rome, a private horror, repackaged as a public banner. A wife, transformed into a martyr while she was still bleeding. Brutus would make sure her suffering paid for his republic. Her blood would wash a king off the throne, and the fool would stop pretending. Drop your city and country in the comments below, so we know where you're tuning in from tonight. If stories like this deserve to be remembered, take a second to subscribe and help us keep digging them up. You're watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. To understand the man Brutus would become, you have to crawl inside the Rome that built him. The Rome of the late 6th century BC was not a republic. It was not a kingdom in the noble sense either. It was a private estate. And the man who held the deed was Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, the 7th king of Rome, the last one Rome would ever tolerate. He had not inherited the throne. He had not been chosen by the Curiate Assembly the way earlier kings had been. He had taken it, the way wolves take a carcass. His path to the crown ran straight through the body of his own father-in-law, King Servius Tullius. The same Servius who, according to Livy, had reorganized Roman society into census classes. The same Servius who had given the plebeians a voice in the Comitia Centuriata, the king the common people actually loved. Tarquin had married a woman who matched him gram for gram in ambition. Tullia the Younger, the dead king's own daughter. Livy gives us the detail that there had been 2 Tullia sisters and 2 Tarquin brothers. Tullia the Younger had been married to the gentler brother. She did not want the gentler brother. She wanted the wolf. So she arranged the deaths of her own sister and her own first husband. And then she married the surviving Tarquin over their fresh graves. Together, they planned the coup with the cold patience of butchers prepping a slaughterhouse. On the chosen morning, in the year tradition fixes around 535 BC, Tarquin walked into the Senate house wearing the royal robes he had not yet earned. He sat down on the king's chair. He began making speeches. When old Servius, hearing the news, rushed in to demand what was happening, Tarquin did not argue. He grabbed the old man by the waist and threw him bodily down the stone steps into the street. Old hands, white hair, a long life of service to a city that owed him its constitution. He landed in the dust below the Curia, broken, bleeding, still breathing. He tried to lift himself up. His servants gathered him. He began to crawl toward home along the Vicus Cyprius, the narrow street that ran beneath the Esquiline. That is where his daughter found him. Tullia's chariot came rattling down the same street. Her eyes were locked on the Senate house. She wanted to be the first to hail the new king, her own husband. Her driver saw what was lying in the road. The old man, his master, the bleeding sovereign. He pulled hard on the reins, and the horses stopped. Tullia did not weep. She did not scream in grief. She screamed in irritation. She tore the whip from the driver's hand and lashed him across the back. Her voice was sharp enough to peel skin. "Drive on!" she shouted. "Drive on! Over your king!" The driver obeyed. The wheels of the chariot rolled over Servius Tullius. Wood crushed bone, skull, ribs. The undercarriage came away, wet. Tullia arrived at the forum with her father's blood drying on the hem of her gown. She kissed her husband on the steps of the Curia. She called him Rex. The Romans never forgot that street. They renamed it the Vicus Celeratus, the Street of Crime. Centuries later, in the age of Augustus, mothers still pointed it out to their children when they passed through the Subura. Livy says he could still walk it in his own day and feel the air go cold. That was the family. That was the bloodline. And that was the household Brutus had to call his own. He breathed that air every day. Air thick with paranoia. Air spiced with the metallic tang of recent murder. Tarquin the Proud ruled the way he had taken power. Through dread. Livy tells us he stopped consulting the Senate on matters of state. He stopped filling vacant seats when senators died, so the body shrank year by year. He executed the senators he suspected of loyalty to the memory of Servius. He confiscated their land. He gave it to his clients. He surrounded himself with armed bodyguards, a thing no Roman king had done before. Cicero, writing 4 centuries later in his De Re Publica, marks this as the moment when kingship became tyranny. The bodyguards walked behind him in the forum with axes inside bundles of rods. The lictors of a man no one had elected. He shut down the public assemblies. He drained the treasury to raise monuments to himself. He began the great temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Palatine Hill, a structure so vast it would not be finished in his lifetime. He paid for it with the sweat of the citizens. He put the people of Rome to work as state slaves on his great drain, the Cloaca Maxima. Men dug in shifts that broke their backs. They lowered themselves into the wet trench by rope. They breathed air that stank of rotting reeds and sewage from the marsh between the Palatine and the Capitoline. They slipped in the mud. They coughed blood. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century A.D., would later marvel that the drain still stood, vaulted with stone the size of wagons. He did not mention the men who died building it. Livy did. He says some of them hanged themselves on the scaffolding rather than go back down. Tarquin's Rome was a sealed pot on a hot fire, and Brutus was inside it. His mother was Tarquinia, the king's own sister. That blood, in another household, would have been a passport to honors. In this one, it was a verdict waiting to be carried out. Brutus had seen with his own eyes what happened to men of standing in this court. The king saw enemies everywhere. He saw them at his own table. He saw them in his own family. Brutus had watched his father, Marcus Junius, a respected nobleman, killed on Tarquin's order, his estate seized, his name erased from the records. Then Brutus had watched his older brother, sharp and well-liked, go the same way for the same offense, being too visible, being too capable, being alive while the king was nervous. Brutus was still a boy, but he could already do the math. To be intelligent was to be marked. To be capable was to be dangerous. To be noticed was to be dead. So he made a choice that would steer the rest of his life. He chose to disappear in plain sight. He let his shoulders sag. He let his jaw hang loose. He cultivated the slow blink, the fumbling hand, the sentence that trailed off into nothing. He let his cousins shove him and trip him and pour wine over his head at dinner. He let them call him Brutus, the dullard. That was not the name his father had given him. His real cognomen vanishes from the record. The mask ate it. Dionysius of Halicarnassus, writing his Roman Antiquities in the time of Augustus, says, Brutus even let Tarquin seize his inheritance. He surrendered his father's gold without a word of protest. He stood there blinking while the king's men carried the chests out of the house. That single performance may have saved his life. A man fighting for his property is a man with a mind. A man drooling at the loss of it is a man you can keep around for laughs. He became the court's pet idiot, the harmless ornament who could be insulted at dinner and forgotten before dessert. They kept him alive because he amused them, because he made them feel sharp. And every single day, for years, Brutus performed. Every word out of his mouth was rehearsed. Every clumsy gesture was choreographed. He was an actor on a stage where the audience was his family's executioners. One bright remark, one flash of intelligence in his eyes, one smile at the wrong moment. The axe would fall. Beneath the drool and the slow speech, something was hardening. A mind like cut stone. He was cataloging everything. Which senator drank too much and talked? Which slave heard which secret? Which of the king's sons was the most reckless? Which was the most cruel? Which centurions of the city watch had quietly buried fathers in Tarquin's purges? He was building a map of every fault line in the dynasty. He was waiting for the regime to slip. One mistake, one overreach loud enough to wake the city. The mistake, when it came, did not arrive on a battlefield. It came from a wine cup. The Roman army had been camped outside the town of Ardea for months. Ardea sat about 24 miles south of Rome, on a plateau above the Tyrrhenian coast, the capital of the Rutuli, a wealthy town with thick walls and a temple to Juno that was older than Rome itself. Tarquin had attacked it for its gold. Livy is blunt about this. The treasury was empty. The Capitoline temple needed funds. The siege was a robbery dressed as a war. It dragged on. Long, dull months. No glory. No loot. Just dust and flies and bored soldiers sleeping in leather tents that smelled of sweat and lamp oil. The king's sons and their cousins, the high command of Rome, had nothing to do but drink. One evening they gathered in the tent of Sextus Tarquinius, the king's most dangerous son, the one whose temper had its own gravity. Titus and Aaron's, his brothers, were there. So was their cousin Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus, the commander of the garrison at nearby Collatia. Lamps burned. A slave poured Falernian into bronze cups. The canvas walls glowed amber. The wine flowed. The talk turned, as it does in rooms full of entitled young men, to their wives. Each one began to boast. Mine is the most loyal. Mine is the most modest. Mine spends her nights in prayer. This was not a conversation about love. It was a conversation about property. Each wife was a possession whose value was measured by her obedience. The boasting was a contest of ownership. The loudest of the bunch was Collatinus. He was a generation older than the others, married into a slightly different branch of the Tarquin family through his father Agerius. Husband to a woman whose reputation was already famous across Latium. Lucretia, daughter of Spurius Lucretius Tricipitinus, the prefect of the city. Collatinus stood up, swaying, eyes bright with wine. He said his Lucretia was beyond any of them. He sneered at the royal princesses. He said the matter could be settled in one night. "Let us ride to Rome," he said, "tonight, unannounced. We will see for ourselves what each wife is doing while her husband is away. Then we will know." The plan was idiotic. It was also irresistible. Sextus Tarquinius leaned forward. Something moved behind his eyes. A slow, curious heat. He agreed first. He was always going to agree first. They were on horseback within the hour. A dozen young commanders, drunk and laughing, cracking jokes about what they expected to find. They rode the Via Ardeatina north through the dark. Hooves on packed earth, sparks where iron shoes struck flint. The smell of pine and salt from the coast slowly giving way to the smell of the river and the city. They were a force of unchecked privilege, men who believed the night belonged to them, because in their world, it did. They came up through the Porta Capena around midnight. The forum was empty, a few oil lamps still burning in the shrines. The watch let them through without question. Royal blood opens any gate. They went to the palace on the Palatine first. They found the royal princesses in the middle of a banquet. Music from a Greek flute. Laughter loud enough to spill out into the courtyard. Hair loose, cups raised. Friends sprawled across couches stained with wine and oil. There was nothing illegal about any of it, but Rome had a script for a proper matron, and this was not it. A respected Roman wife was supposed to be at her loom, sober, surrounded by her maids, missing her husband, not throwing parties. The princes pretended to be disgusted. Maybe some of them were. They mounted up again and rode out through the Porta Esquilina, east toward the home of Collatinus, in the small town of Collatia, 10 miles down the road. The horses were tired. The men were not. They arrived in the dead hour before dawn. The contrast hit them at the door. No music. No shouting. The house was quiet. Lamps burned low in clay holders set into the walls. The air smelled of wool and oil and the smoke of a hearth that had been banked for the night. Inside the atrium, beneath the open roof, where a few stars still showed through the impluvium, they found Lucretia. She was not at a feast. She was at her loom. Her maids were spinning and carding around her in a small ring of lamplight. Her hands were moving with steady, practiced rhythm. The shuttle clicked. The thread tightened. Her eyes were on her work. She was the living script. Pudicitia made flesh. The Roman virtue that fused modesty and chastity and loyalty into one word. The virtue that, 2 centuries later, would still be carved on the tombs of women whose husbands wanted the world to remember them as worthy. She looked up when the door burst open. Soldiers, wine on their breath. Her husband at the front. She did not panic. She did not stammer. She rose. She arranged her stola. She greeted them by name. She woke the kitchen slaves. She sent for bread, for olives, for warmed wine. Her composure did not crack for a second. Collatinus puffed up like a rooster. His friends slapped him on the back. They congratulated him. His property had been proven the finest in Rome. But one man in that atrium was not smiling. Sextus Tarquinius was watching her. He was the son of a tyrant. He had been raised inside a household where power was the only language and the only morality. He had grown up watching his mother whip a driver into rolling a chariot over her own father. He had been taught, by a father who took thrones with a shove down a staircase, that anything purchased with violence was honestly earned. In that house, anything pure was an insult. Anything unbroken was a challenge. He looked at Lucretia, at her calm hands, at her quiet voice, at the lamplight catching the silver pins in her hair, at the way she did not flinch under the eyes of a dozen drunk men, and what rose up in him was not respect. The historian Livy says an evil thought entered his mind that night. Mala libido Lucretiae per vim stuprandi. Dionysius of Halicarnassus expands the scene with more dialogue, but agrees on the substance. The thought to take what could not be given, to break what could not be bought, to prove that no virtue stands when a prince decides to grind it under his heel. He said almost nothing for the rest of the visit. He drank his warmed wine. He thanked her for her hospitality. He smiled at his cousin. He just watched her, the way a hunter watches a deer drinking at a stream. Brutus was not in that tent at Ardea. He was not on that midnight ride. He was back in Rome, shuffling through the palace corridors on the Palatine, drooling on cue, fetching cups and dropping them, playing the dullard for whatever scraps of conversation he could overhear. He slept in a small room near the slave quarters. He ate what the slaves ate. He spoke when spoken to. He was 30-some years old, and he had been holding his breath for a decade. But news like this moved fast through the aristocracy. By the next morning, before the horses were even rubbed down at Ardea, the story was being told over breakfast in half a dozen noble households. The contest, the partying princesses, the flawless Lucretia at her loom. Within days, every senator in Rome knew the tale. Lucretia's reputation, already shining, was polished to a blinding gleam. She had been tested in front of witnesses and crowned the model of Roman womanhood. For a predator like Sextus, that made her the ultimate target. For a strategist like Brutus, it made her the ultimate weapon. A crime against a private woman would be a private grief. A crime against a national symbol would be a national rupture. It would be a public declaration that the royal family was at war with the soul of Rome itself. Brutus did not know yet what was coming. He could not have. But he knew the dynasty was leaning. He knew the senators who had lost fathers under Tarquin still met quietly at night in the houses on the Palatine Hill. He knew the comitia had not been called in years. He knew the city was a stack of dry kindling. One push, delivered at the right moment, against the right body, would bring the whole structure down. He had been sharpening that push for years inside his idiot's mask. If you believe these stories deserve to survive, that history's darkest chapters need to be told without the polish and without the lies, then you already belong with us. We built a place for people like you. It is called The Lineage. It is the membership club of this channel, and it is the engine that keeps this project running. When you join, you stop being a viewer and start being part of the crew. You get early access to our documentaries. You get exclusive material the public never sees. And you keep the lamps lit in this archive of forgotten history. If you are one of us, hit the join button and take your place in the ranks. Sextus Tarquinius rode back to Ardea with the others before sunrise. He laughed at the jokes. He drank from the same skins. But something inside him had already left the camp. Part of him was still standing in that quiet atrium in Collatia, watching a woman bend over her loom in the lamplight. In his world, purity was not something you admired. It was something you conquered. He was the son of a king, and kings take what they want. A few nights later, Sextus told his servant to saddle a horse. He did not tell his brothers. He did not tell his father. He did not ask leave of his commanding officer, which happened to be himself. He took one attendant. He took a sword. He rode out of the camp alone, past the sentries who saluted without looking up, and turned the horse's head north, toward Collatia, toward a house with low lamps and a quiet loom. And inside that house, a woman was finishing her work for the night, calling her maids to bed, lifting a cup of water to her lips, with no idea that the road outside her door was already carrying the man who would end her life. 4 nights had passed since the contest. The siege at Ardea ground on with the dull patience of a tooth slowly rotting. Most of the men who had ridden to Rome that night had already moved on from it. Collatinus carried it like a medal pinned to his cloak. The princes carried it like a faint embarrassment they would rather forget. Sextus Tarquinius carried it like a fever. The image had not left him. Lucretia at her loom in the lamplight. The shuttle clicking against the warp threads. The composure of a woman who did not know he was watching her. It had lodged behind his eyes and would not move. He drank to drown it. He went hunting in the hills outside the camp to outrun it. Neither worked. Dionysius of Halicarnassus tells us he confided in no one. Livy says the same. Whatever sickness was growing in him, he grew it alone. He was a Tarquin. The rules other men obeyed had always struck him as decoration. His father had taken a throne by throwing an old man down a flight of stairs. His mother had driven a chariot over the body. His grandfather, Tarquinius Priscus, had been assassinated by the sons of a previous king. His uncle Arruns had died under mysterious circumstances. The Tarquin family tree was a list of corpses and the cousins who had stepped over them. Hospitality, decency, the sacred ties between guest and host. These were ropes meant for other people's hands. He told no one. Not his brothers Titus and Arruns, not his father, encamped a quarter-mile away in the king's pavilion, not his attendants. He saddled his horse himself in the dark, before the second watch, took a single servant boy, and rode out of the camp under a sky still thick with stars. The sentries waved him through. He was a prince of the blood. No man challenged him. The road to Collatia was 20 miles of bad track, up out of the coastal plain, through pine forest, past the marshes of the Numicus, hooves on gravel, the horse breathing hard on the long climb. He passed shepherds asleep beside dying fires. He passed milestones whose painted numerals had peeled. He passed a wayside shrine to Silvanus, where someone had left a clay cup of milk. He did not stop. He reached the town near sundown on the second day. The sun was low over the Sabine hills behind it. The walls of Collatia were tufa block, the color of old bone. The gate guards recognized his face and stepped aside. The house of Collatinus stood at the eastern edge of the town, a modest aristocratic compound with a low wall and a heavy oak door studded with iron nail heads in the shape of a rosette. Sextus dismounted. He handed his reins to his servant. He knocked. When the porter opened the door and saw the king's son standing alone in travel dust, the household locked into motion. A boy ran to the kitchen. A woman ran to the back of the house to call her mistress. Lucretia came into the entryway in the same stola she had worn at her loom 4 nights before. Her hair was up. Her hands smelled faintly of lanolin from the wool she had been carding. She recognized him at once. He was her husband's cousin. He had stood in this same atrium days before, laughing and drinking her wine. She greeted him by name. She invited him in. The sacred law of hospitality, the unwritten code that made travel possible in a world without inns. A guest, once received, became part of the household, protected by Jupiter Hospitalis himself. To turn away a kinsman of rank would have been an insult that echoed for a generation, an act the family priests would have called sacrilege. Lucretia obeyed the code. She was the perfect Roman wife. She was doing what every matron in Latium would have done. Sextus had counted on every step of it. He told a small lie about why he had come. A message for the prefect at Rome that had to wait until morning. A horse gone lame on the road. A wish to rest the night before continuing. She believed him. She had no reason not to. He carried no escort. He wore no armor. He came as a kinsman, not as a prince. The evening meal was served in the small triclinium. 3 couches arranged around a low cedar table. Lamps burning olive oil. Bread still warm from the household oven. Cheese from the family goats. Olives in brine. Wine from the estate's own vineyard, cut with water in the proper proportion of 1 part wine to 3 parts water. The way a respectable Roman household served it when a kinsman came to call. Sextus reclined across from her. He spoke easily. He asked after her father, Spurius Lucretius Tricipitinus, who was prefect of the city. He asked about her household. He praised the bread. He performed a civilized man with the same skill Brutus performed an idiot. 2 masks, mirroring each other, 20 miles apart. The meal ended. The slaves cleared the table. Lucretia called for a guest chamber to be prepared in the cubiculum off the western corridor. She thanked him for the news from the camp. He thanked her for her table. She withdrew to her own room at the back of the house. The maids went to their quarters near the kitchen. Lamps were trimmed. Doors were barred. The household sank into the slow breathing of a house asleep. A bar across a door is no defense against a threat already inside the walls. Sometime in the dead hours, when even the kitchen fires had banked to ash and the dogs in the courtyard had gone quiet, Sextus rose from the guest bed, fully dressed. He drew his sword from its sheath, a Greek-style xiphos he carried for personal protection. He walked barefoot through the corridors of a house whose floor plan he had memorized that afternoon under the pretext of admiring the mosaics. He came to Lucretia's chamber. The door was barred from the inside. He set his shoulder against the oak and shoved. The wood splintered around the bracket. Lucretia came up out of sleep into a nightmare she could not yet name. A shape standing over her bed. Moonlight on a blade. A hand clamped across her mouth before she could scream. "Be silent, Lucretia. I am Sextus Tarquinius. 1 sound and you die." He laid the flat of the cold sword across her throat. He kept his weight on her chest. He began to speak. A grotesque mixture of declarations and threats. He loved her. He had loved her since he had first seen her at her loom. She would submit. She would belong to him. She did not collapse. Livy is precise on this point. So is Ovid in the 2nd book of his Fasti, where he gives her the longest passage any Roman poet ever gave a woman. She fought him. She twisted under his weight. She told him she would rather die than yield. Her eyes, even with a blade at her neck, refused him. She was the daughter of Spurius Lucretius. She was the wife of Collatinus. She was Lucretia. And she said no. Most men would have lost their nerve at that. Sextus did not. He was the son of a tyrant. And tyrants understand that the body is not the deepest part of a person. The deepest part is the name, the reputation, the story that will be told after the body is dust. He saw that threats against her life were failing, so he reached for something worse. He leaned close. His breath was on her ear. "If you refuse me," he whispered, "I will not only kill you. I will go to the slave quarters at the back of this house. I will pick out one of your male slaves, the youngest, the one most likely to be believed. I will cut his throat. I will carry his naked body back to this bed and lay him beside you. And in the morning I will tell your husband, your father, and all of Rome that I caught you in adultery with a servant and killed you both to defend the honor of the Tarquin name." This was the deeper violence, the one that left no bruise. Roman society had built a cathedral around female chastity. Pudicitia was not a private virtue. It was a public office. There was a temple to her on the Vicus Longus, where only women of unblemished reputation were allowed to sacrifice. A woman caught with a slave was the lowest figure the moral imagination of Rome could produce. The law of the household, the ius mariti, would have allowed her husband to kill her on the spot. Her tomb would be unmarked. Her father would be shamed into exile from the Senate. Her name would become a slur mothers used to frighten daughters into obedience for the next 300 years. Sextus was offering her a choice between two deaths, one private and silent, one public and eternal. She lay still. The struggle ended. He took what he had ridden 20 miles for. When it was finished, he rose without looking at her, sheathed his sword, walked back through the corridors he had crept down an hour before, mounted his horse in the gray light before dawn, and rode south. He was back inside the camp at Ardea before the trumpets called the watch. He went straight to his tent. He slept until noon. No one questioned him. Lucretia did not weep. She did not call her maids. She lay alone in the wreckage of her bedroom, and her mind began to work. She rose. She washed her body in cold water from the basin in the corner. She dressed in black wool, the color a Roman wore for the dead. She arranged her hair without help, twisting it into the 6-strand seni-crines knot that married matrons wore for solemn occasions. She called for a writing tablet and a stylus. She wrote 2 letters on wax, one to her father, Spurius Lucretius, at his office in the prefect's chambers near the Forum, one to her husband, Collatinus, at the camp at Ardea. The message was the same in both. "Come at once. Bring a witness you trust. A horror has come to this house. Tell no one on the road." She sealed both tablets with the ring she wore on her left hand, a carved carnelian her husband had given her on their wedding day. The messengers rode at full gallop in opposite directions, one north along the Via Praenestina, one south on the coast road. Spurius Lucretius received the tablet at the prefect's office near the Comitium. He turned white. He read it twice. He grabbed his cloak. He took with him his close friend Publius Valerius, a senator of the old Republican-minded faction, a man whose great-grandfather had served under King Ancus Marcius and whose family had been excluded from Tarquin's inner circle since the coup. Valerius was a man Tarquin distrusted. That distrust was about to become useful. Collatinus received his tablet inside the command tent at Ardea, around the 8th hour. He was on his feet before he had finished reading. He shouted for a horse. He shouted for a companion. The closest man to him in that camp, by accident or by fate, was the cousin who had been shuffling around the edges of the staff for weeks, eating scraps, dropping things, drawing laughs from the junior tribunes. Brutus. Collatinus did not stop to ask why. Maybe he wanted company on the road. Maybe he wanted someone he did not have to talk to. Maybe Brutus volunteered with one of his slow, gormless smiles. The Roman annalists do not agree on the reason. They agree only on the outcome. The fool got on a horse. The fool rode toward Collatia. They rode through the night and into the next morning, changing horses at a posting station near Lanuvium. Brutus rode like a man who had ridden hard before. Collatinus, in his grief and his speed, did not notice. The four men converged at the house in the long afternoon. Lucretia was waiting for them in the atrium. She was seated on a low, backless chair near the impluvium. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her face was a piece of carved marble. Her eyes were dry. The afternoon light came down through the open roof and pooled around her feet. She waited until all four were inside the room: her father, her husband, Valerius, Brutus. Then she spoke. Livy preserves her words. So does Dionysius, with small variations. She did not raise her voice. She did not break. She named the date. She named the hour. She named her attacker, Sextus Tarquinius, son of the king. She described the broken door, splinters of which still lay in the corridor where the slaves had not yet swept them, the blade at her throat, the threat that had finally bent her, the slave who would have been killed and laid in her bed to forge the proof. She looked at her husband. The marks of another man are on your bed, Collatinus, but only my body has been violated. My mind is innocent. My death will be the proof. Her father broke first. Spurius Lucretius rushed to her. He took her hands. He told her the mind sins, not the body. Where there is no consent, there is no guilt. Collatinus, behind him, was already weeping into his cloak. Valerius stood frozen, the senator in him calculating even as the friend in him grieved. They begged her. They offered her every form of comfort the Roman vocabulary allowed. They told her she was blameless. They told her she would be loved, as she had always been loved. They reminded her of the rites of expiation a priest could perform. They saw a wife, a daughter, a wound that could be bandaged. Brutus saw something else. He had not crossed the room. He had not wept. He stood by the door of the atrium with his arms at his sides. The vacant look was gone. The sag in his shoulders was gone. The slack jaw was gone. His face had reorganized itself into a face no one in that room had ever seen. For 30 years, he had been waiting for a single moment. A crime committed by a member of the royal house. A crime against a witness no one could discredit. A crime so cleanly aligned with every value Rome claimed to hold that no senator could publicly defend the criminal. A crime that violated hospitality, marriage, kinship, and the protection of Jupiter, all in a single act. Sextus had just delivered him all four. Brutus listened to every word Lucretia spoke, and did not miss one. He noted the way she sat. He noted the dagger he could now see, half hidden beneath the fold of her stola at her right hip. He noted that she had arranged the witnesses herself. Her father, who could speak in the Senate. Valerius, who could speak to the senators Tarquin distrusted. Her husband, who could speak to the army. And himself. The fool. The wild card. The one no one would be watching. She had chosen them. All four. By name. She had been writing the script while the messengers rode. Before her father could finish his pleas, before her husband could promise vengeance, Lucretia produced the pugio from the folds of her stola, a small dagger with a leaf-shaped iron blade and a bone handle, the kind Roman women sometimes carried for protection on the road. She had laid it across her lap before they arrived. None of them had seen it. "You will see to his punishment," she said. Her voice did not waver. "As for me, though I am free from guilt, I will not free myself from the penalty. From this day on, no unchaste woman shall live and use Lucretia as her excuse. She drove the dagger into her own chest below the sternum, angled upward into the heart, the way a Roman soldier was taught to kill an opponent at close quarters. There was no hesitation in the stroke. There was no second blow needed. The blade went into the hilt. She slumped forward off the chair. The blood ran down the front of her black stola and pooled on the mosaic floor in a slow, dark circle that spread toward her father's sandals. Her suicide was not collapse. It was construction. She had taken her own private wound and forged it in front of 4 chosen witnesses into a public document signed in arterial red. She had made it impossible to bury this quietly. She had made it impossible for her father to negotiate with the king. She had made it impossible for the Senate to look away. She had stripped the regime of every defense it might have offered. There would be no rumor of adultery, no question of consent, no years of legal argument in front of a bribed jury. Only a body, only a dagger, only 4 men who had heard her speak the name Sextus Tarquinius before she died. She had handed Brutus a weapon shaped exactly like a republic. He stepped forward. Before you see what he does next, take 30 seconds for this. If you want to read the source that holds this story together, the book that built the spine of this investigation is Livy's History of Rome, books 1 through 5, in the Penguin Classics edition, translated by Aubrey de Selincourt. It is on the shelf below the video right now. Tap the View Products button, and it will open. Livy wrote this in the reign of Augustus, 300 years after the fact, and he wrote it with the precision of a man who knew Rome was already forgetting itself. Owning this book is the difference between hearing a story and understanding a civilization. While the shelf is open, look at the rest of what we curated for this episode. Replica daggers in the Roman style, coins from the early Republic, pieces tied to the world you are watching, the kind of objects most channels never bother to find. Open the shelf, see what is waiting there. Bring a piece of this story home. Lucretia's body was still warm. The dagger jutted from her chest at the angle she had driven it. Her father was on his knees, his hands in her blood, calling her name as if she might answer. Collatinus had collapsed against the painted wall, his shoulders shaking. Valerius stood with his mouth open, and no sound coming out, his senator's mind not yet caught up to what his eyes were seeing. Brutus walked across the atrium. His sandals left marks in the spreading pool. He bent over the body. He took the dagger by the bone handle. He pulled it free with a single steady motion. The blade came out wet to the hilt. He straightened up, holding it in front of him. His knuckles were white. His face was the face of a stranger. The 3 other men in the room stopped breathing. When he opened his mouth, the voice that came out of him did not belong to the fool they had known their entire lives. It was lower. It was steady. It carried the cadence of a man who had been rehearsing this sentence in the dark for 3 decades. He raised the dagger above the body of Lucretia, and he began to swear an oath that would tear down the Roman monarchy before the sun rose again. While Collatinus and Spurius Lucretius were paralyzed, while Valerius stood with his mouth still open, Brutus was already moving. He did not kneel. He did not weep. He had pulled the dagger from Lucretia's chest with the calm of a surgeon, and now he stood holding it above her body, the blade red to the bone handle, drops running down his wrist and disappearing into the cuff of his tunic. The other 3 men stared at him. Their grief stalled mid-breath. The face they were looking at did not belong to the cousin they had known. The slack mouth was gone. The empty eyes were gone. In their place stood a man with the bearing of a magistrate and the gaze of an assassin. "By this blood," he said. His voice rolled through the atrium and bounced off the painted plaster of the walls. It was the first time any of them had ever heard him speak in his own register. "By this blood, so pure before a prince laid hands on it, I swear, and I call you gods above and you gods below to witness, that from this day I will pursue Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, his criminal wife Tullia, and every child of their blood, with fire, with iron, with whatever weapon comes to my hand. I will not allow them or any other man to be king in Rome, not while I draw breath, not while this city stands." Livy preserves the oath almost word for word. Dionysius of Halicarnassus gives it twice, once in Greek and once in a Latin reconstruction. Cicero, 4 centuries later in De Re Publica, would quote a fragment of it to argue that the founders of the Republic understood liberty as a vow sworn over a corpse. It was not an oath of vengeance, it was an oath of extinction. Brutus was not declaring war on a man. He was declaring war on the institution of monarchy itself. 244 years of kingship, beginning with Romulus, running through Numa, Tullus Hostilius, Ancus Marcius, Tarquinius Priscus, Servius Tullius, had just been served with a death notice over a body on a mosaic floor. He turned to the 3 men. He walked to Collatinus first. He pressed the bloody hilt into the widower's hand. "Swear," he said. The widower swore, his voice cracking, repeating the oath word for word. Brutus took the dagger back. He turned to Spurius Lucretius, the father, the prefect of the city, the man whose office gave Brutus the legal access he was about to need. "Swear." The father swore. Brutus turned to Publius Valerius, the senator whose family Tarquin had been quietly suffocating for a decade. "Swear." The senator swore, and in his eyes something cold and political was already calculating the distance to the forum. Brutus had taken 3 grieving men and bound them inside 30 seconds into a treason that carried only one penalty if it failed: crucifixion in the Roman manner. He had also given them the only escape from that penalty: speed. He was not finished. "We do not mourn her here," he said. Spurius Lucretius lifted his head. He did not understand. "We do not wash her body. We do not close her eyes. We do not call the Libitinarii. We do not summon the priests of Libitina. We do not light the candles. We take her into the street exactly as she is. We take her to the forum of Collatia. Then we take her to Rome." This was the second masterstroke. Roman funerals were elaborate civic events that began only after the body had been prepared, the eyes pressed shut by the closest male relative, the body washed in warm water, anointed with oil, dressed in the toga praetexta or matron's stola, and laid in state on a couch in the atrium for up to 7 days beneath the wax imagines of the ancestors. A professional prefica was hired to lead the keening. Flute players were paid. The conclamatio, the formal calling of the dead person's name 3 times, marked the official beginning of mourning. Brutus tore that ritual to pieces. He understood, the way only a man who had studied power for 30 years could understand, that an idea alone could not move a city. The people needed to see. They needed the wound. They needed the dagger. They needed to smell the blood. They needed a body that had not yet been made comfortable by ceremony. He was about to give them a relic. They lifted the litter. 4 men, 1 corpse, 1 dagger still wet in Brutus's hand. They walked out through the broken bedroom door, through the atrium, through the entrance hall where she had greeted Sextus the night before, past the household lairs, whose small bronze figures she had garlanded the previous morning, and into the dust of the street. It was the 11th hour. The light was low and yellow on the tufa walls of Collatia. A dog barked somewhere down the lane. A woman at a well dropped her clay jug when she saw what was coming. Word ran ahead of them the way fire runs through dry stubble. Wives came out of doorways. Slaves stopped in mid-stride with water jars on their shoulders. The town's small forum filled within minutes. Brutus did not stop walking. He led the procession to the speaker's stone in the center of the square and stood on it. He did not begin with Lucretia. He began with Collatia. He named the men of the town who had been conscripted into Tarquin's wars and never returned from the siege at Suessa Pometia. He named the families whose land the king had confiscated near the road to Gabii. He named the boy Aulus Mucius, 11 years old, who had died last winter inside the cloaca because Tarquin's overseers would not let him climb out for fever. He pointed to the half-built temple on the hill and reminded them whose taxes had paid for it. He spoke for perhaps a quarter of an hour. Then, only then, he pointed down at the litter. "This," he said, "is what their house does to ours." The men of Collatia were already moving toward their weapons before he finished. The town garrison, commanded in absence by Collatinus himself, opened the armory at the prefect's word. The keys hung on the wall behind the Duumvir's chair, and the Duumvir handed them over without asking a question. By sundown, Brutus had a column behind him, 200 armed men, a wagon for the body, drawn by a pair of gray mules, torches lit against the falling dark, pine pitch flames that sent black smoke trailing behind the column, the way smoke trails behind a war signal. They marched the 10 miles to Rome through the night, along the Via Gabina, past the sanctuary of Anna Perenna on the riverbank, where women left small clay vows. Brutus walked at the head. He did not ride. He wanted to be seen at the same height as the men behind him. They came up through the Porta Esquilina just before dawn. The watch did not stop them. Spurius Lucretius was prefect of the city. The gate was his to open. The captain of the watch, a centurion named Marcus Horatius Pulvillus, took one look at the body in the wagon, recognized the daughter of his commanding officer, and joined the column without a word. He would, within months, become one of the first consuls suffect of the new republic and dedicate the temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline that Tarquin had begun. They moved down the Vicus Cyprius, the same street where Tullia had driven her chariot over her father a generation before. The older men in the column whispered the name of that street to the younger ones as they passed. The Vicus Sceleratus, the street of crime. They emerged into the forum just as the first light was touching the tiled roof of the Regia, the king's residence built by Numa Pompilius 3 centuries before. Brutus ordered the litter set down on the open ground in front of the Curia Hostilia, the Senate house built by Tullus Hostilius. He set Lucretia in front of the seat of power. The dagger he laid across her chest, the pugio with the leaf-shaped iron blade. He arranged her hands across the hilt. The forum at that hour was beginning to wake. Bakers carrying trays of round country bread, slaves drawing water from the Lacus Curtius, senators walking up from their houses on the Palatine and the Caelian, wrapped in their togas against the morning chill. They saw the body. They stopped. They asked. The crowd doubled, then doubled again. Within an hour, the forum held perhaps 3,000 people. The shops on the Vicus Tuscus closed their shutters. The flute girls in the Velabrum stopped playing. The whole transactional pulse of the city went silent and turned to look at the dead woman in front of the Curia. Brutus climbed the rostra. The rostra at that date, 509 BC, was a plain stone platform near the Comitium. The bronze ship beaks that would give it its name would not be mounted until 338 BC, after the conquest of Antium. It was a slab of tufa with 3 steps. He stood on it alone. Below him, perhaps 5,000 citizens now. Many in the crowd squinted at him and could not place him. Then a murmur moved through them. The fool, the king's idiot nephew, the one who drooled at dinner, the one who tripped over his own sandals. What is he doing on the rostra? He let them murmur. Then he began. He did not speak about Lucretia first. He had learned that lesson at Collatia. He spoke about them. He named men in the front row by their fathers' names. He named the senators who had disappeared in Tarquin's purges: Marcus Valerius, Titus Herminius, Spurius Cassius the Elder, the father of the boy standing third from the platform. He listed the years of unpaid labor on the Cloaca Maxima, 18 years. He read out the figure of grain seized from the public stores for the royal household. 40,000 modii in the last year alone. He gave the number of citizens executed under the Lex Regia in the past decade. He had been memorizing those numbers in the dark for a decade. The crowd was a different shape by the time he finished the indictment. It was leaning forward. It was angry. The men in the back, who could not hear every word, were pressing toward the front. The senators who had filtered into the forum from their houses had stopped on the steps of the Curia and were listening with the rest. Then he pointed at the body. He told them what Sextus had done. He named the date. The night before last. He named the house. The villa of Collatinus, in the town of Collatia, at the 3rd hour after sunset. He named the door that had been broken. He told them about the slave who would have been killed and laid in her bed to forge the evidence of adultery. He told them about the threat that had not been a threat of death, but a threat of disgrace. He told them she had ridden no horse, drawn no sword, struck no blow, and she had still defeated the king's son with the only weapon left to her, which was her own life. Her body is your body, he said. Her shame is your shame. The hand that broke her door will break yours next. There is no daughter in this city safe from a man who can walk into any house in Rome because his father owns the gates. The crowd erupted. Brutus did not let the moment cool. He moved at the speed of a man who had been waiting 30 years to move. He proposed 3 measures from the rostra. Tarquinius Superbus, deposed from his office and stripped of his imperium. The entire Tarquin family, banished from Rome and the territory of Rome forever. Their property confiscated and divided among the citizens. The title of king abolished, and any man who attempted to restore it, satyr, devoted to the gods of the underworld, who could be killed by any citizen without trial and without blood guilt. The vote was taken by acclamation, in the old manner of the comitia curiata. 3 roars, one after the other, the third louder than the first. The senators on the steps of the curia raised their right arms. The motion carried. 244 years of monarchy ended in a single morning. The Roman tradition would fix the date later as the 24th of February in the consular calendar that did not yet exist. Tarquin the Proud was still at Ardea when the messenger reached him. Livy says he set out for Rome at once with a small troop of cavalry. He rode the 24 miles in a single day, switching horses at Aricia. He arrived at the Porta Capena at the 2nd hour of the night to find the gate closed against him. The men on the walls did not jeer. They simply did not open. He shouted up his name. He shouted up his titles. The men on the walls turned their backs and walked the parapet away from him. Tarquin rode north along the wall to the Porta Collina. Closed. He rode west across the Campus Martius to the Porta Trigemina. Closed. The largest empire builder Rome had yet produced sat on his horse at sundown outside his own capital, locked out by the silence of his own citizens. He turned south. He fled into exile in Etruria, first to the city of Caere, where his ancestors had once been kings, then on to Tarquinia, the city that had given his family its name, and finally to the court of Lars Porsena at Clusium, where he would spend the next decade trying to raise armies. Tullia, his wife, the woman who had once driven her chariot over her father, fled the Regia in panic. Livy says the people in the streets cursed her as she passed. They called the names of Servius Tullius and Lucretia after her. They threw refuse from upper windows. She rode out the Porta Capena before her husband even knew Rome had risen. She vanishes from the record there. No Roman historian ever bothered to write down where she died. Sextus, the rapist, fled separately. He rode north to the town of Gabii, the same town his father had ordered him to betray years before through a piece of theater that Livy preserves in detail. Sextus had pretended to be a refugee from his father's cruelty. He had won the trust of the Gabines. He had murdered their leading men one by one and handed the town to Tarquin. The people of Gabii had a long memory. When he arrived at their gate in flight, they recognized him. They killed him in the street with thrown stones and farming tools. No grave, no marker, no funerary inscription. The Roman annalists could not even agree on the year. The Republic needed magistrates. Brutus had drafted the structure on the long ride from Collatia. 2 consuls, elected each year by the Comitia Centuriata, holding the powers of the king split between them, each able to veto the other, and only for 12 months. He laid the proposal before the assembly the same week. The first 2 consuls of the Roman Republic, elected in the year tradition fixes as 509 BC, were Lucius Junius Brutus and Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus, the fool and the widower, the architect and the husband. They took the fasces. They sat on the curule chairs in the forum. The wax masks of their ancestors were set out in their atria for the first time in their lives. Collatinus would not last. His name carried the cursed syllable. Within months, Brutus would convince the assembly that no man named Tarquinius could hold office under the new order, no matter his loyalty, because the name itself was a poison the city could not keep down. Collatinus accepted the decision. He left for Lavinium with his property intact and disappeared from the records there. The historian Valerius Maximus, writing under Tiberius, would call his exile the first sacrifice of a personal name to a public idea. Publius Valerius took his place as consul suffect. He passed the laws that gave the people the right of appeal against any magistrate, the leges Valerii, and earned the cognomen Publicola, friend of the people, that his family would carry for the next 5 centuries. Brutus himself would die within the year. Tarquin tried to take Rome back. He worked first through diplomacy. He sent ambassadors who arrived in the forum requesting only the return of his personal property. The Senate debated for 3 days. The property was a hostage. Brutus saw it. While the ambassadors were lodged in noble houses, they recruited. Among the young men they corrupted were the 2 sons of Brutus himself, Titus and Tiberius Junius Brutus, boys of 19 and 20. The plot was uncovered by a slave named Vindicius, who overheard the conspirators sealing a letter to Tarquin in the house of the Vitelli. Vindicius went to Valerius. Valerius arrested the entire ring. Brutus, as consul, presided over the trial of his own sons in the forum. The historian Plutarch, in his Life of Publicola, says the boys did not deny the charge. They asked their father for nothing. They expected nothing. The penalty for treason against the new republic was the same penalty Tarquin had once imposed on Brutus's father: death by the rods and axe. Brutus did not delegate. He sat in the curule chair and ordered the lictors forward. The crowd in the forum, including the boy's mother, begged him to grant exile instead. He refused. The lictors stripped the boys to the waist. They tied them to the post. They beat them with rods until the flesh opened. Then the axe came down. Twice. Brutus watched both strokes without moving his face. The slave Vindicius was freed on the spot by act of the consul. The word for that ceremony, vindicta, the touch of the rod that converted a slave into a citizen, would carry his name for the rest of Roman history. A few weeks later, Brutus rode out at the head of the Roman cavalry to meet Tarquin's army at the Battle of Silva Arsia, in the forest near the border of Etruria. The king's son, Aruns Tarquinius, led the enemy horse. The two men saw each other across the field. Aruns charged. Brutus charged. They drove their spears into each other at the same instant. Both fell from their horses, dead. The infantry battle that followed lasted until nightfall. Livy says it ended when a voice was heard from the forest, the voice of the god Silvanus, declaring that the Romans had won by one body. The Etruscans broke and ran. Rome buried Brutus in the Forum with the honors of a founder. The matrons of the city wore mourning for him for a full year, as if for a father. A bronze statue of him would later be set up on the Palatine Hill, among the 7 kings he had ended, holding a drawn sword. 500 years later, on the Ides of March in 44 BC, his descendant, Marcus Junius Brutus, would stand under that statue and decide to kill Julius Caesar. But look back at this story with cold eyes. The Republic was not born in a riot. It was born in a script. Brutus did not stumble onto power. He hunted it for 30 years from behind the mask of an idiot. He waited for the perfect crime against the perfect victim by the perfect villain. When Sextus delivered all 3, Brutus moved with the speed of a man who had been rehearsing his lines in the dark since boyhood. He used a dead woman as a banner. He used her father's grief as fuel. He used her husband's name to legitimize his consulship, and then discarded the husband when the name became inconvenient. He turned a private horror into a public sacrament and built a state on the floor where she bled. He executed his own sons to prove that the new order owed nothing to blood. Was Lucretia avenged? The man who raped her was beaten to death by the people of Gabii. The dynasty that produced him was scattered across Etruria and died out in exile within 2 generations. Was the Republic worth it? It would last 482 years. It would conquer the Mediterranean. It would give the world Cicero and Cato and Scipio and the idea, however imperfect, that no man should be king. It would also, in the end, eat itself and produce the Caesars who would restore the very thing Brutus had sworn over a corpse to destroy. But it was built on a body, and the man who built it was the same man who had stood in the temple at Delphi and pressed his lips to the dirt while his cousins laughed, because he had already understood, even then, that history rewards the patient and remembers only what the survivors choose to write down. The line between a tyrant and a liberator is sometimes only this: who is left alive to tell the story? And who holds the stylus? Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. If something in it cut close, drop a single word in the comments. Lucretia. So we know you walked the whole road with us. Subscribe to Ancestral if you have not already. Hit the like. Send this video to the one person in your life who reads history the way you do. You have just watched another premium documentary by Ancestral, your ultimate history hub on YouTube. Now look at your screen. Another investigation is opening beside this one. Another forgotten night. Another buried name. Click it. The descent continues,